to the cloud.
There
Okay.
you go. Now
There we
you're
go.
recording.
Got it.
Got it.
Got it.
Sorry. Okay. Can you see, am I
Viral.
sharing screen or no? I'm not sharing screen.
No, just you're on.
Okay. Get back to my presentation there. Now can you see it?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Now we'll get started. So thanks everyone for joining with just a few minutes of technical challenge. We've got people that are there in person at the church, and then those of you who have joined virtual. So as I was saying, this is the third segment of the 4-part series we're doing on the history of the church, since we're celebrating our 150th. So I'm going to start us off with prayer. And if somebody will be thinking of who wants to close us in prayer, okay? So join me in prayer, please. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and our time together. Please help those among us and that we care for who are sick, in rehab, in the hospital, and are grieving. Help us be better stewards of the gifts that you've given us. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm going to start off as we did the last 2 Sundays. We talked about why we're studying history. It's important to learn from it and not repeat the same mistakes. And the Bible even tells us to study history. And then we talked about some of our goals for this 4-part session. We want to learn more about our history, and it helps direct where we're going and maybe inspire us to do something more challenging and get out of our comfort zone, perhaps. And maybe it might be an easier way to share our faith, some of these stories. I talked to you a little bit about my inspiration for why I got started on wanting to write this book, and spent the last couple years researching it. And here's the chapters, and that's how we've been organizing our discussion of the history. So I started out with the first 5 chapters. We did that in session 1, and these recordings are available on our website if you missed any of them. So we covered the first 5 chapters the first week. We covered the second 5 chapters in week 2. And like I said, both those videos are out on our website where you see the pastor's sermons. And then today we're going to cover the next 4 chapters. And then next week we'll close out with the final 4 chapters. And if we have time at the end, we may even talk a little bit about the section I call the pews. And as I talked to you about last week, I got so interested in the research. In fact, it was hard to get busy writing the book because the research was so much fun. But I got really curious about the people. Who were these people that founded our church? Who were these people that did these wonderful things like starting a church and starting an orphanage and starting Temple University? Who were those people who went out and got the funds to help build the chapel of the Four Chaplains? So I was real curious, and there's not a lot about individuals. You can find a whole heck of a lot about Russell Conwell, but not a whole lot about the rest of the Grace Baptist members. So what I wanted to give this person who's writing our history 150 years from now is some information about us. So as many people as I could would agree to talk to me and that I could get to, I interviewed you, and your stories are part of this book too. And those chapters are in between those 35 chapters, those 17 chapters or 18 chapters I just showed you. In between each of the content chapters, the stories about Temple Camp, the story about the hospitals, in between each of those chapters are sections I call the pews. And the pews include stories about you and current members, former members, and then some people that maybe never joined but attended our church. Any of those people that agreed to speak with me and tell me their experiences about coming here, I interviewed. And on the point of the book, or the takeaway I hope people will get, is that God's voice is out there if we just listen for it. And collectively or individually, if we listen for it and follow it, great things can happen. So at this point, I'm going to stop and show you the next section of the video. Another thing we've done in addition to this book to help celebrate the 150 is we've put together a video, and many of you participated in that video. So we're going to watch the 3rd segment of the video. So I think I have to stop sharing this and go to the video. And here we go. We're getting started. We're talking about, at this point, we finished off last week. We're talking about how we had, the church had dwindled in size, and we decided to buy the property out in Bluebell. And unfortunately, when Temple bought the Baptist Temple building from us, they let it decay for many years. And at one point, it looked like it was going to be demolished. So we're kind of picking up at that point. Let me see if I
am Grace
hang on
Lee.
just a second. Let me make it big screen here.
Ultimately, Temple University did save the historic landmark building and the congregation that founded it. Today, the building is Temple Performing Arts Center.
Hi, I'm Ryan Bachlet, and this is a photo of my grandmother, Barbara Green, and my brother and me when the church was celebrating my grandmom's 50th year as organist. It's now been 61 years since she was asked to be a substitute organist.
I'm Barbara Green, organist and music director, and this is from the Disney Community Concert Grace Baptist put on several years ago. For many years, we did these yearly, and not only members and friends came, but we filled the church with busloads of people who came from retirement communities.
I am Don Halpa. Grace Baptist has continued its focus on education, ordaining over a dozen new ministers. Here, our 13th pastor, Reverend George Hawthorne, is ordaining Armando Sado.
Hello, I'm Chris Lister, and this is a photo from my ordination at Grace Baptist. I am currently pastor at Church in the Acres Baptist Church in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Grace Lunga and I'm from the Congo. Grace Baptist has long supported missionaries around the world. This is a newspaper clipping about Lulu Fleming, American Baptist's first African-American woman missionary and its first missionary to the Congo. She was one of the many missionaries the church supported over the years.
I am Nelson Hayashida. My wife Sandra and I were members of the Baptist Temple, now Grace Baptist. This is a photo from our days as missionaries in Zambia. Today we live in California.
I'm Sandra Hayashida, and as Nelson indicated, we felt God's calling to Zambia. Grace Baptist supported us through many victories and trials. Our long relationship continues with increasing appreciation.
I am Jean-Luc Krieg, and I was a member of Grace Baptist. I started an organization in Mexico and later Colombia to address urban poverty in a comprehensive, multifaceted way called urban transformation. We, as a people, not just Christians, have a responsibility to address the evil and injustices that lie at the root of urban poverty.
This is Obed Arango. He and his wife, Kathy Kautz Arango, started Sacate as a way to address the needs of the growing Latino community in Norristown. They've made opportunities for people to contribute to their community and also provide after-school homework help and college prep training. Kathy is currently working in Connecticut for the University of New Haven. They've appreciated their girls growing up at Grace Baptist and the support they've received from the church as they launched and grew Sacate.
I am Dwight Bullock. My wife Barbara and I were members of Grace Baptist and felt God's call to serve the indigenous Mapuche people of Chile. There I worked with rural pastors and leaders to learn beekeeping. We also trained communities in how to harvest rainwater to solve severe water shortages. And now, with the Water for All project, we are training partners in 5 Latin American countries to use rainwater harvesting.
Hi, I'm Barbara Bullock, and as Dwight mentioned, we spent nearly 20 years in Chile. One of the most important projects I worked on there was establishing the girls' clubs. We so appreciated over the years the love and support and visits we received from Grace Baptist.
I am Pat Matthews. In addition to supporting international ministries, Grace Baptist has a program called Faith in Action. Once a year, we forego our regular Sunday services and instead organize community service projects like visiting shut-ins, preparing breakfast for local firefighters and police officers, doing repairs for homeless shelters, cleaning local parks, and other similar projects.
I am Harold Matthews. We wear our Don't Go to Church, Be the Church shirts and find ways to share God's love with others.
I'm Luke Sharp. Grace Baptist has been one of the churches that provide homeless families shelter for more than 30 years. This is part of Interfaith Housing Alliance, which provides food, transportation, and lodging at area churches for people experiencing homelessness.
Hi, I'm Kristen Poluska. For many years, our youth group participated with REACH mission trips. REACH brought together youth and their leaders from across the country for 1 week to repair and restore homes for those in need.
Hi, I'm Samuel Parent, and as part of Grace Baptist continued efforts to serve, other teams have gone to New Jersey to help with cleanup and repairs after Hurricane Sandy, and likewise to Galveston, Texas, and to Maryland to help work on
recording
outreach center. Thanks.
I can hear you on the
Hi, I'm Ed Poluska, and this is me volunteering at a local
Stop
breakfast
there.
for those who are hungry.
We'll pick up,
Our members and friends
pick up with
regularly
Ed next
volunteer.
week. Let's see if we can get back to the presentation here. Okay. So we'll finish off the video next week. I'm gonna, like I mentioned at the beginning, go ahead and jump to the 4 chapters that we haven't covered yet, and then we'll do a quick review at the end, so that in case anybody has to leave early that are there in the building getting ready for our service today. So last week we talked about what would be covering this week, which are the chapters on the Chapel of the Four Chaplains, Temple Camp, Women of Grace, and music. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So the Chapel of the Four Chaplains. For some of you, this story is, you could tell it yourself in your sleep probably, but hopefully I can bring out a detail or two that you may be not as familiar with. So we established this chapel in the lower floor of our church when we were located in the city. And it was designed kind of in a Romanesque way, like the churches in Europe were done at the time, where those crypts that would have memorials built were kind of to represent the foundation of the church. So the church established this, and it was dedicated on February 3rd, 1951. But the purpose of the church had to do with these 4 gentlemen pictured at the top of the screen, 4 chaplains. And the reason why it was important to us and why it was up for consideration to be built in our church is the gentleman on the right was the son of our current pastor at that time. Our current pastor at that time was Daniel Poling. And so the church had been talking about building a memorial to Conwell, because he had been an important figure, not only to our church, but in the city, and helping to found Temple University and the hospitals and the orphanages and everything. So we thought it would be a worthy thing to build a memorial to Conwell. But it just so happened at this time, Pearl Harbor had happened in 1941, on December 7th, 1941. And a lot of people, just like after 9/11, a lot of people were feeling very patriotic and really wanting to do something to help America. And so a lot of people began to enlist, and these 4 men of faith decided to enlist. So I want to tell you a little bit. I think the story is even more important, or becomes more meaningful, when you know a little bit more about the 4 men there. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. John P. Washington, he's the gentleman with the glasses on, and he was the oldest of 7 children in an Irish Catholic family in New Jersey. And he grew up kind of in a rough and tumble neighborhood, and he got into some kind of fight, and there was a BB gun involved, and he almost lost the sight in one of his eyes. And so when he enlisted, he first tried to enlist with the Navy and he couldn't pass the eyesight test. So the next time when he applied to the Army, he covered his bad eye both times when he read the chart. And the examiner wasn't paying that good of attention. A lot of men were going through the line, and so he passed because his good eye was good enough to get in. He thought he was hopeful that God would forgive him for doing that. But there's a lot more. There's more detail in the book about these families, and I used this book. It's Daniel Kurtzman's story, No Greater Glory. Really wonderful book about what happened with the Dorchester, and this was one of the torpedo of this air transport ship was one of the worst sea disasters of World War II. So there's a lot that's been written about it, not just the book I showed you. There's a lot out on the internet. The Army has some articles about it. I borrowed some material from there as well. But I did get pay for publishing permission to use some of what's in this book. So there's also Guideposts did a beautiful article when some of the survivors were still alive, and there was a lot of quotes, and it really makes the event very personal, and you can almost feel like you were aboard the ship. So let me tell you a little bit about what was going on. So let me finish telling you about the four men first. Okay, the next one I want to tell you about is Alexander D. Good, and he's right next to Father Washington. He was a rabbi, and he grew up in DC, and he became a rabbi like his father, and he married his childhood sweetheart, who was named Teresa Flax, and she happened to be the niece of Al Jolson. What also makes this story more personal is in my book, as well as in the one I showed you, there's a lot of letters and quotes from the family and things, their last things said to their loved ones, and that certainly makes the story come alive. The next one is the gentleman on the far left is George L. Fox. He was the oldest of the four chaplains, and he grew up in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He actually grew up in a Catholic family, but he had a kind of a rough childhood, and he ended up rejecting his Catholic faith and becoming a Methodist minister. But as I said, he was the oldest of the four chaplains. He was 42, and he had actually served as a medic in World War I. And he happened to rejoin the service on August 8th, 1942, which was the same day his son joined the Marines. His son Wyatt also joined that same day. So these four men actually met up at a Camp Miles Standish, and Camp Miles Standish was a kind of a staging camp for servicemen that were headed over to Europe. And so that's where they initially met, had some training, and prepared for their journey, which what they ended up having to do was they were chartered to go to Greenland. On this ship, you see down there in the lower half left corner is some places say SS Dorchester, and most of the material I looked at said USAT, United States Army Transport Dorchester. So either way, it's the Dorchester. And the Dorchester, before it was a transport ship for the Army, it had been recommissioned. It was a luxury ship, so it had worked as a cruise ship. Well, these men felt nothing of that because it was completely refitted and had about twice the number of people on it than would have been on it as a cruise ship. But I didn't finish telling you about the four men. The fourth one was Clark Vandersol Poling, and he was the son of our pastor, Daniel Poling. And he came from, just like Harry has 6 generations of family that's gone to Grace Baptist, Clark Poling came from 6 generations of pastors. So it was kind of in his fate that he would become one also. He was a pastor of a Dutch Reformed church. But he grew up, and his father was famous, even before he came to Grace Baptist, he was a very well-known radio evangelist and a religious newspaper editor, Daniel Poling was. But he would come to Baptist Temple and visit his father, who was the pastor there, and he actually met his wife at Baptist Temple in Philadelphia, and her name was Betty Young, Jung. So, and when he was headed off to service, when he got called, he asked his father not to pray for his return. He said that wouldn't be fair. That would be, all the men deserve to be prayed for to return. But he said he wanted instead for him to pray that he should never be a coward and pray that instead that I shall have strength and courage and understanding of men, and especially that I should have patience. And so what was interesting about the 4 men to all the servicemen aboard the Dorchester was that they all got along so well, and they seemed to really be, good friends and enjoy each other's company. And why that was so surprising to the men is at that time, interfaith cooperation wasn't a usual thing. Many of the men said, where I grew up, the Irish priest did not speak to the Protestant minister, much less have a conversation with the rabbi in town. And so this was a different kind of view of faith to many of the men, to see each of these men with very specific different views about faith come together for a greater purpose and serve, because they were there to serve these men and their faith, and to be an antidote to fear. I think that faith certainly served that. Okay, so I think I told you about the Dorchester was a former cruise ship. A few more things about it. It was on its 5th journey, and it was going from New York. They left New York, headed to Greenland. And at that time, Greenland was being used as a supply base for our troops in Europe. So they were sending a lot of supplies up to Greenland, and then they would fly them over to Europe. So of course, the enemy would try to hinder our supply route, because that would hinder our efforts in the war, correct? So the Germans had subs floating in that area. So unfortunately, the Dorchester wasn't very fast. In fact, they nicknamed it the suicide ship, because it had a speed of less than 12 knots, which I didn't know what a 12 knot meant, but I looked it up, and a knot, it was about 1.15 miles per hour. So it was creeping along in the waters, right? And then this area of the North Atlantic at the time, they called it Torpedo Junction, because of all these subs that were floating around, wolf packs they called them, trying to take down these ships. So the men boarded the Dorchester there in New York City, headed to Greenland. They made a stop in Newfoundland. I'm not sure why. I didn't say. I'm not sure if they had to pick up more supplies, exchange men, get more fuel. I'm not sure what the reason was that they had to stop, but they made a stop in Newfoundland. Well, as you can imagine, the Germans probably had spies there in Newfoundland trying to get information on what was going on. So they heard about this convoy, and the Dorchester wasn't alone. It was part of a 5, actually, I think 6 ships that were with it. There was 2 freighters, the Biscaya and the Lutz, and then there was 3 Coast Guard cutters, and these were like smaller ships, boats that were meant to help in the event of emergency. They were full of Coast Guard rescue men, the Tampa, the Escanaba, and the Comanche. And this entire convoy of ships was called the SG-19. So the men, reboarded the Dorchester, and then were on their way to Greenland. Unfortunately, it was one of the worst storms that the North Atlantic had. That's what they were faced with when they got aboard. So it was rough seas. Many of the men were sick. And that night, before they went to bed, the captain of the Dorchester came on the loudspeaker and warned the men, look, the seas are rough. We know, we've had word that there's submarines out there. You need to sleep in your clothes, sleep with your life jacket on. It's very important. If we can make it through the night, we should have some additional ships to help us with the last part of the journey to Greenland. Well, I'm not sure why most of the men didn't listen to it. It could be a number of things. They were young. We know we're so very smart when we're young. It could be youth. It could be that it was so hot beneath the decks of the ship that they couldn't bear to sleep in their clothes. But most of the men did not sleep prepared. A little bit about the submarine. A couple of the pictures here that before I leave this page, there's a mural on the right. It used to be in the chapel of the Four Chaplains. It is today at the Four Chaplains, where it is current location in the Naval Yard. And then I'll take you to the second set of pictures, which Up there on the far corner was a picture of the Dorchester. And the third picture on the top is a picture of one of the German U-boats. So let me tell you a little bit about the submarine that ended up launching the torpedoes that struck the Dorchester. It was a U-boat, a U-223. It was on its maiden voyage, and it was captained by a 26-year-old gentleman called Carl Jörg Wachter. And he was trying to make a name for himself, as I'm sure, and they all were, and he was hoping to get a big ship. And the torpedoes guy's name was Erich Passler, and he was ordered to give a shot at the Dorchester, and he shot 3 torpedoes in the direction of the Dorchester. And unfortunately, it did strike. It was at 12:55 a.m. in the morning, and most of the men were asleep, but some were killed instantly when it struck the boat. Some were injured and died from their injuries, but others were wandering around in shock. They weren't well prepared. From what the documentation shows, there could have been enough U-boats and life vests aboard the ship had they been prepared enough to find them. But from what the survivors have said, the 4 chaplains went into action immediately in helping men find their way to the lifeboats, helping men get into their life jackets. One survivor talked about how he was just about ready to jump over the side of the ship, and he realized he forgot his gloves. And he said, he's looking at the icy water beneath him, and he knew he was going to get frostbite if he didn't have his gloves, but he didn't have time to go back and get his gloves. The ship was sinking. And he said, Rabbi reached out and he says, here, I brought my extra pair, take mine. And the guy argued with, no, I can't take your gloves. He said, no, I have my extra pair. And he said, the survivor said later, as he's floating around in the icy water, he said, nobody would have grabbed a second pair. Nobody would have thought to do that. So the rabbi was really very self-sacrificing to give that up. And in the end, as the men could no longer find life jackets, one of the chaplains took off his own life jacket, put it on a man, and then all the rest of the chaplains did the same thing. So they gave up their own life jackets when they could have been the first on a lifeboat. I think from what the survivors talked about, how well respected they were, I think all the men would have gladly helped those chaplains get on the lifeboat first, but instead they helped and served their fellow man. So there is a very heroic and beautiful story about love of your fellow man here. A couple other pictures I wanted to point out to you. I have a couple of pictures of the Chapel of the Four Chaplains when it was in the bottom of our church. Up in the right-hand corner is the outside of the door. And then there's a picture of the sign, the Chapel of the Four Chaplains, and you can see the brickwork of the building. Then over next to the title, Chapel of the Four Chaplains, is what it looked like inside the Chapel of the Four Chaplains. We had this altar. It was a revolving altar. And as I interviewed those of you who have memories of the downtown church, this revolving altar is something you remember very vividly. I had it described to me where I can see it, and I've never seen it. So you did a good job of describing it to me. I don't know if that's the Protestant altar there or not, but there are pictures. We have pictures of each of the altars. The other pictures I wanted to show you, that there in the center is a picture toward the bottom is a picture of President Truman when he came on February 3rd, 1951 for the dedication of the Chapel of the Four Chaplains. And then the picture to the left is Charles S. Let me get his name right. Charles S. David. And there's the most recent book about the Four Chaplains. A gentleman out of Texas wrote a book about the Four Chaplains, but he added Charles S. David into the story. And I think he took out chaplains and called it the Immortals. Another name for the Four Chaplains, they called them the Four Immortal Chaplains. And so they included that he wanted to include the story of Charles S. David because he was another person who exemplified heroism and the tragedy of this story. He was aboard the Comanche. Now, another sad thing that happened, there was a lot of terrible errors involved with this tragedy. the captain of the whole convoy's name was Greenspun. And once the Dorchester had been struck by the torpedo, you would have thought that the immediate thing would have been what? To go get those men out of the icy Atlantic before they freeze to death, right? Well, Captain Greenspun didn't see it that way. And there was another protocol. It wasn't like he completely thought this up on his own, but another acceptable protocol would be to have the ship search for the torpedo to try to take it out. Unfortunately, that left some men to die in icy waters because it was 45 minutes before Captain Greenspun ordered one of the Coast Guard cutters to go rescue the men. So the men aboard those Coast Guard cutters were very upset that they couldn't. They were trained. That's what they were trained to do, was go rescue people. But Captain Greenspun had them hunting for the German U-boat. Well, the Germans later said that was kind of stupid because at the time, the immediate thing that the U-boat would have done after it hit a big target would have been sunk to the bottom so that they wouldn't get hit by one of the ships, wouldn't get seen on radar and risk being taken out. So that's exactly what they did. They sunk to the bottom to avoid detection, and they waited, hoping those ships would focus on rescue and wait till things calmed down before they tried to sneak away. But eventually they did. But this one captain, the picture of the man on the boat there, you see, he was the commander of the Comanche. And even though he was ordered by Captain Greenspun to monitor the perimeter of the area, watching for that U-boat, and he was ordered, by the way, not to pick up any survivors. His main job was to look for the U-boat, but he couldn't help it when he did. He disobeyed orders and actually rescued some men. And Captain David, not Captain David, but Charles David there in the lower hand corner, he was on that Comanche. Now, he was not a Coast Guard rescuer. They did not let, at that time in the Army, they did not let Black people have just any old job. You got the lower level jobs. And so his job was to, even though he was a trained tradesman in New York, his job was to clean the officers' rooms. So, but the men aboard the Comanche, even though a lot of them were trained rescuers, it was icy, turbulent waters that they were jumping into. So even though that was their job, some of them were freezing in their steps, unable to jump in, knowing they might be jumping to their death. But this gentleman, even though it wasn't his job to rescue anyone, he jumped in. And he rescued not only some of the survivors, but some of the men that were aboard the ship. They're trying to survive people. They ended up being in trouble themselves. So he rescued quite a number of people, and he later died himself of pneumonia not long after the incident. But the last thing I wanted to say about that, although there's a lot we could talk about in a whole Sunday school class, I think, on the Chapel of the Four Chaplains, is today it's located at the Navy Yard. There in the right-hand corner is the Chapel of the Four Chaplains. There's always, every year, they do a lot to try to raise money to keep the chapel in existence. Next year will be their 80th anniversary. So I'm sure they're going to have some big events around that. This year, they have an anniversary celebration every year. I did listen, Wreaths Across America had a special presentation online on February 3rd, the anniversary, or Four Chaplains Day. So it's interesting, and the connection with our church, I think, is very interesting. And our pastor himself had been a chaplain, Daniel Poling. Any questions about the Chapel of the Four Chaplains or the story? Okay, we'll move to the next one. Okay, Temple Camp. You might wonder why we would have a whole chapter on Temple Camp. So what? Baptist Temple had a camp. Interestingly enough, a lot in the interviews, I think as many important memories, it was almost equal of the people who had long-time associations with the church. They would bring up the memories of the camp as if they were just as important as the memories from the church. So I think it was a significant point in their lives. And I think maybe we could have a takeaway that maybe there's something we could do in today's time from a recreational standpoint that would attract people to other people of faith. I don't know. There's some thought there. But the genesis of the Temple Camp may have come from years ago in 1890, we had something called the Temple Brigade. So post-Civil War, the people were still interested in the Civil War, and people had experience being in the Civil War, and the stories were still there. So they started these military drill groups, and we had one at Baptist Temple called the Temple Guard, and it was started as for Sunday school boys like age 9 to 15, but they actually ended up having their own newspaper. They had a regular newspaper they put out almost weekly, and I think it ended up being even for older boys as well and young men. It became more of a social as well as a discipline kind of organization, social organization as well. But as part of their practices, and they competed against other drill teams in Philadelphia and won quite a few from what I understand. But part of what they did, they would go each summer to an encampment and practice and get better at these drills that they would do. So it may have come from that idea that we eventually bought this property out in Collegeville. And I think even members were involved in building it. I don't know if they did all the building themselves or if they just assisted with the construction of the cabins. There was a recreation building as well as a mess hall and an outhouse. So you got to understand, this was 1922. So there was no running water. There was no indoor plumbing, pools, air conditioning, or refrigeration. So one of the memories that really struck me when somebody was bringing up remembering the Iceman coming to bringing the big blocks of ice to go to the mess hall to keep their food cold. So the children from Baptist Temple would go to this camp as well, along with their neighbors and friends and relatives. And often the kids grew up and they themselves became the counselors. And then and usually it was 2 week, from what I understand, it was a 2-week camp, 2 weeks of the girls and then 2 weeks of boys. And then at some point, I think they were intermixed, but anyway, the people would get there. You see in the collage of photos, when you got to camp, one lady described it as these huge pillowcases. They would have these mattress bags, and they would fill them with straw, with hay. See the hay? There's a bale of hay, if you can tell in that little picture. They would fill these large pillowcases, if you will, with hay, and that's what they slept on. And their parents, when they got there, would help them fill these large pillowcases, and that was their bedding for the 2 weeks. And there was, people described the fly paper hanging to catch the bugs, and that there was chamber pot at night for you to go to the bathroom in, and the last person to use it in the morning had to empty it, so you didn't want to be that person. And they talk about getting the badges for swimming and canoeing, and then the times on the weekend when the parents would come and it was a big picnic. So there's some pictures there, and the picture on the right hand corner with Lloyd's father, Pastor Paulin, is Joan Frizzell and her brother. That was one of the family weekends, and so the pastor came out as well. And you see pictures of people swimming, and like I said, people describe this camp in great detail. I feel like I may have been there myself, even though I've never seen it. So, and they would sing songs under the tree. People remember the different songs. What else? Eventually, just like with the church, as our membership dwindled and budget got pressed, we had a hard time figuring out how to still maintain this camp. Our membership had gotten older, and like I said, membership had dwindled. So the decision was made to sell it. So evidently we sold it for something around like $13,000. And today it exists very successfully as a Jewish camp. It's called Camp Gan Israel. It's at the same location as it was. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything that they want to add, since some of you were actually at that camp? Okay, I'll move along. Okay, the next chapter is Women of Grace. And the reason women get their own chapter, I know, seems kind of silly, right? But the reason why I decided that there should be a standalone chapter about Women of Grace is that considering the time when the church was founded, women didn't even have the right to vote. From the beginning of what I can tell from the history and what was written, women have long had leadership roles and been highly involved in the work of the church. And I thought that was significant. And even up until many of the stories of people coming to the church in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s, talked about walking into other congregations and seeing that the diaconate was all male, that women didn't want to do that part. They didn't want to collect, they just wanted to clean the communion cups. They didn't want to be responsible. There was a feeling that our church was more advanced in thinking and having women involved in leadership roles. And if you look, even today, we have a good many women are involved in our leadership. So some of the stories that are pointed out, this is Russell. The two women in the center are Russell Conwell's two wives. The first wife is the one in the forefront, Jenny Conwell. And when he was in Minnesota, he was a newspaper editor of a paper called the Star of the North, Conwell's Star of the North. And they had taken over this newspaper, and Jenny Conwell was in charge of the ladies department. And in her first editorial, and mind you, this was in 1868, she talks about how, not unlike the previous owners, this ladies department isn't going to be all about recipes and fashion, that today's women want to know about more topics than that, and that men want thinking wives and daughters. And I thought it's very interesting that at that time in 1868, she felt progressive enough to step outside what was the norms of the time, I think, and inform people that we women want to talk, are more interested in things that everybody, than just things that they thought we were. It goes on from there. When Conwell was starting Temple University, as we talked about last week, and he pulled people from the congregation and got them teaching the classes in the basement of our church. And one of the people he got immediately involved with this is this lady on the left, Laura Carnell, and she's holding her pearls there. She was a teacher in the Philadelphia School District, and I'm sure a Sunday school teacher somewhere at Baptist Temple. And he pulled her immediately into the involvement of the founding of Temple University. And she is credited as being his right-hand man in helping that university get organized, stay financially viable. And if you look into what's out there, people even credit her with the founding of 11 of the 17 schools today. Not much is said about her today, so I think it is worthy of us to pay attention that she was important and to note that and helping that. In fact, they even wanted her at one point to be president of Temple, but she demurred, and but the president that came in insisted that she would still remain on board and help, and she did. She was committed to that goal that Conwell had of bringing education to the working people who couldn't get it because they had to work during the day. And then the picture up on the upper right-hand corner was just a fun one that I guess at our 125th celebration, we dressed up in costume from the Victorian era of when Baptist Temple was founded. So I just thought it was a wonderful photo and included it. And then there's a picture on the lower right-hand corner of some of our ladies at one of the rally day. And I think if you just look at, I just got to thinking as I was preparing the presentation and talking about women of grace, if you just stop a moment and think about some of the women, Jeanette Simpson, 79 years with the choir. That's pretty remarkable. You look at Barbara Green, 61 years as the leader of our choir. You look at Trish Simpson, 25 years with us. It's remarkable. I don't think there's many churches that can demonstrate that kind of commitment to the church. And if you look at our different boards across the church, there's lots of women, and some boards are all female. So, okay, we'll go to the next chapter. And music is very important. It came up in a lot of the interviews with you all when I spoke to you. It's a very important part of our worship. It's a way many of us feel our connection and experience God is through music. I love this quote, so I'll share it with you here. Music isn't just a pleasure, a transient satisfaction. It's a need, a deep hunger. And when the music is right, it's joy, it's love, a foretaste of heaven, a comfort in grief. Is it too much to think God speaks to us sometimes through music? I have a lot of examples, and I'll touch on some of them here, but you can read about them in the book. There's some from Conwell. Conwell was a musician himself. He played the cornet, the violin, and the organ. There's some stories in the book about his childhood and getting an organ that are fun. And then another one about when he was playing the cornet at Cape May on the boardwalk. So those are some very fun stories I invite you to read when the book comes out. But what I cover in the chapter is two remarkable people I think we have in our history are pictured here. One on the left there, the gentleman with his hand on his face, is David Duffield Wood. And he was a very well-known organist in Philadelphia, and he became our organist. He was already an organist at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, and he became our organist when our organist got sick. And his son actually came to our church, and he, along with Conwell, asked his father if he would come and be our organist. So he would play in the morning at St. Stephen's and then come at night and play for us. And I think it was interchangeable sometimes. But I think we had some wonderful music. And he began with us, actually, we were at that first church building at Berks and Mervine. So even before we were in the big building, he was with us. And when he started with us, we only had like 20 people in the choir. And as you can see, when we built the big church, that picture there in the lower corner, we built that church and had the big amphitheater of rows of choir seats. And one point in one of the biographies of Conwell, it talks about this rising amphitheater of seats. And at one point that we had a choir of 250 that was probably the largest in the United States at the time. So, and he's interesting, and some of this is in the book, some of his thoughts about running a choir rehearsal. I'm thinking, Barbara, did you study him? He was evidently very organized, and anyway, it's pretty interesting stuff. And then the other person, of course, that requires mention in our history is Barbara, with her 61 years with us. And I won't go into a lot of that because we gave a wonderful tribute to Barbara last year, and I've included some of that in the book because I think certainly her service to Grace over the years is remarkable. But and I go over in the book some of the different groups of music we have at Grace Baptist, from the children performing, which I think we all enjoy, to the praise group, the New Life Trio, who's been with us for a long time now and provided the church wonderful music ministry. And then we've also been graced with the group, the Miracles, have performed many times at Grace Baptist, and they had 3 members that were from our church, with Larry Davis, Bob Allman, and Janet Davis played on the piano for them. And there's a picture in the right hand, top right hand, of the Miracles. And then from the lovely music, even when we were forced during the pandemic to have Zoom church like we are now, we had some really nice music that way too. Even though it was hard for us to sing together, we still had some wonderful performance. I love the one with Ryan when he had the backdrop of the camel, so I had to include that one here. And then we have the Renix Girls, and we had some other great songs from choir members, as well as Margaret Montgomery, Bill Branlow, other people contributed. And we had Pastor George was part of our praise team at one time. I think that's what I had to cover for this week. I will give you a little preview of what we'll cover next week. Will be the move to Bluebell, the chapter on that. We'll cover our music, our ministries and our missions and ministries. And then we'll talk about, I have a chapter in the book called From the Pulpit. So these include excerpts from current and former pastors, as well as some other people who spoke behind our podium, including Truman, Helen Keller, Martin Luther King, etc. And then the last chapter is on the future. So do we have any questions? I didn't leave myself a lot of time for review, but if we do have anybody that wants to stay with me, I'll go back and cover on a high level some of the things we talked about from the other chapters, just to give you a high level overview of what we've talked about in the previous sessions. If everybody else wants to hang with me, that's great. Or if you've got any questions, just interrupt me. I'm glad to entertain them. So at the beginning of the session 2 weeks ago, we started with the beginning of the church, how we started from a small group at 10th Baptist Church in 1870, and then actually we were first in a rented hall, and then we got our own building, which really wasn't a building, it was a tent, not just any tent, it was heated and it had a floor. But before long, we made plans to build a building, and that was our very first building at Mervine and Burke's. And that building is no longer there, but this was the building that we had when our fourth pastor came, which was Conwell, and he overpacked the building. He was such a tremendous speaker, and we had so many people that came in from the church that we actually had to give out tickets. This was the church where we were located, and the story of Hattie Mae, must have stood outside this church waiting to get in. And so eventually that church did get demolished in 1969, and it made way for these two buildings here, which is Gladfelter and Anderson Hall. And then we built this big landmark historical building in Philadelphia, which is today the Temple Performing Arts, and with a big half moon rose window. So with stained glass. It had the two domes at the top that four members call igloos. It had some very interesting architectural aspects. It was designed by Thomas P. Lonsdale from Norristown, who designed some other well-known Philadelphia buildings. From there, we moved out in 1975 to our building in Blue Bell, which we'll talk about some more in detail next week. And after that, we talked about the pastors. We did a pastors parade, I called it, showing you pictures of, this is 11 of our 14 pastors. 2 of them I could not find pictures of, but those are our 11 pastors that we do have pictures of. And our longest serving was Conwell at 43 years. Pastor Lewis served 22 years, and 3 pastors served with us 12 years. And those pastors were Poling, Vroom, and Pastor George Hawthorne. Then we spent some time talking about Conwell, because much has been written about him. He was a Union soldier. He was a newspaper guy, a world traveler. He was a lawyer. He had his first church in Lexington, Massachusetts, and we were the second church that he was called to serve. And he was a great orator. He traveled the country giving speeches. Even before he came to us, he had given the Acres of Diamond speech, but he became well known for that speech after he started. And then in the right-hand corner is a picture of Conwell, and he was known as a very tall man. And that was Joan Frizzell's grandparents, and you can see how tall he is compared to them. Any questions? Nope. Okay. We'll move along with the review. Okay. I got off the thing. There we go. We talked about Hattie Mae and the 57 cents and her story of not being able to get into the church, how Conwell used that to motivate. Poor Hattie Mae died of diphtheria, but she had saved 57 cents to go toward the building of the new building. And Conwell used that as an inspirational story to encourage people. But I think it speaks to all of us that we all have something we can give, even though if it seems very small, it can still do great things. Then there was the story of Johnny Ring and the sword, and that was one of Conwell's famous stories that he told. And there's the statue of Johnny Ring on the Temple's campus. We spent some time talking about Temple University and how it was started, not only because a young printer came and asked Conwell to give him a class, but also it was a way Conwell thought to help people get out of poverty. And he saw a lot of that in Philadelphia. People were struggling, and he would see poor people in the street, and he knew, you could give them something to eat, but they were still going to be hungry the next day. And he felt like education was a way to help people get out of poverty. And unfortunately, at that time, people there weren't options to go to college at night. So if you had to work, if you didn't have the money for somebody to pay for you to go to college during the day and not have to work, then you had to work, and you weren't ever going to be able to get an education. But Conwell, with Temple University offering classes at night, enabled working people to be able to get a degree and bring themselves up out of poverty or up from where they were. And so it's a wonderful story, and it was the beginnings of not just Russell Conwell didn't found Temple University. Russell Conwell and Grace Baptist founded Temple University. And then the story of Acres of Diamonds was a famous story Russell Conwell told. And it was a wonderful story about a man who was told this story about finding diamonds in far off land. And he sold his farm to go find these wonderful diamonds so he could become wealthy. Unfortunately, diamonds were found on the very farm that he sold. And so if he had looked harder in his very own farm, he could have found those diamonds. So the story reminds us that we can find wealth right where we are, and we can do good things right where we are. So it's a wonderful story. And then very importantly, right up there with founding Temple University, Grace Baptist also founded an orphanage and also founded 2 hospitals, really 3 hospitals. But those stories are very important, and I think are really examples of how we were trying to be God's hands and feet in the world by people who without means were not able to get to hospitals, and they were too far away or they couldn't afford them. And this was a way Conwell felt to get our people helping to serve people who are being underserved. So great stories for us to share with other people. And then that brings us to what we covered today with the Chapel of the Four Chaplains and Temple Camp and the Women of Grace and music. So I am going to give us a little bit of a break. I'm going to ask again, does anybody have any questions? Okay, then I'll ask if I still have somebody on here that will close us in prayer. Oh, and I think I already covered what we're going to talk about next week. Yes. So is somebody going to volunteer for me to close us up?
Can you hear me? Emma?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
If you would like, I will close.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Emma, again, many thank you for memorializing our history. We appreciate your hard work. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, our church was began in struggle. But through your will, through your direction and guidance, it flourished. These current days, we are also in the times of struggle, while they're different. We pray we will continue to flourish. Lord, we ask that the future generations will continue to struggle as well as to flourish. Thank you, God, for your guidance, your direction, your love. We ask these things in the name of your Son. Amen.
Thanks, everyone. See you in service.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.